Hi friends, we are cranking through this semester already on week 3. And this week we're going to be talking about physical and cognitive development in infancy, which I think is just loads of fun, and I hope you do too. Some things to know before we continue with this really short lecture is that I need for you to toggle in between this video and also your Canvas site, because I'm going to have you pause this video 3 times and go into our module 3 directions and watch short little clips of videos just to really illustrate some of the things that we're going to be talking about. What does it better than the textbook or listening to me gab is to actually watch a baby do these things. So make sure that you have that ready to go, and we can start cruising. Through this chapter, we're going to talk about the physical growth and development in infancy, their motory and sensory, cognitive, and language development. When we look at the physical growth and development in infancy, we are looking at a couple things. We're looking at their patterns of growth, their height and their weight, their brain, sleep, and nutrition. And all of these things are really important in the development of an infant. And the doctors, when you have a child, you will go and participate in things called well check visits, and the pediatrician is very concerned with all of these things, and so the parents that are bringing the child to these doctor's visits are constantly asking about these things. And not that there is one hard fast rule to all of these, it's just we're making sure that they are on the scope of what is fairly normal and what we see in infants. So when we are looking at patterns of growth, we can see that there are developmental sequences in which the earliest growth always occurs at the top of the head, with physical growth and differentiation of features gradually working their way from the top to the bottom. And you can see, I'm not even going to try to attempt how that word is pronounced, but that starts with that C word. And of course, this type of developmental sequence includes your physical, sensory, and motor development. That proximodistal pattern is the sequence in which growth starts at the center of the body and then moves towards the extremities, okay? So all the way out to your fingers and your toes, and that includes muscle control, and of course that starts in their trunk and then their arms, and that is where, if you have ever been around an infant, where they gain muscle control first. It's really important to realize that growth occurs in episodes rather than continual. So children will often have growth spurts, you probably have heard, and then nothing will happen, and then they'll have another growth spurt. But they're happening in episodes, and it's not just continual growing. This is a pretty interesting graphic about the changes in proportions of the human body during growth. One of the biggest key features to notice is the head, how much smaller our heads get throughout our lives in proportion to our bodies. Also looking at the torso and the arms, just how things will eventually change as we grow. Height and weight is really important about looking at an infant and if they are growing the way that they should. The average American newborn is 20 inches long and weighs 7.6 pounds. That is the average. There are a lot of outliers there. Most of the newborns are 18 to 22 inches long and weigh between 5 and 10 pounds. So those are kind of your ranges. If you can, ask your parents about where you fall into this range. It would be interesting if you don't know. Babies grow about 1 inch per month during their first year, and then by the age of 2 years, you can kind of see their stats here. And when we are looking at the brain, I thought that was a fantastic picture. When we are looking at the brain, we can see brains develop. And the brain's development is rapid and extensive growth through infancy and later. A lot of things is happening in that brain, even if we can't see it with our own eyes. The brain is very vulnerable to shaken baby syndrome, and this is why we protect the baby's um, neck and back and their head. As much as we possibly can. There are some tools to measure brain activity, and it does a good job discussing that in your text. So make sure that you look at those two. And then mapping the brain, we can see that they've broken it up into the forebrain that has two hemispheres containing four globes. And this concept of lateralization is the specialization of function in one hemisphere of the cerebral cortex or the other, but both are needed for complex functions. And in this concept, a lot of language has been studied. Make sure that through your reading of your chapter and our activities through our smart text that you understand those for a quiz that's coming up at the end of this module. When we look at the brain, we can see a good amount of different parts of the brain, and it's just something to know. As educators, we do not have to know this specifically. You don't need this to pass any of your licensure tests, but it is just something to know. So let's kind of jump in there. Many changes are happening in the brain during the first year as the brain waits for experiences to make connections. That is something that I really want you guys to understand, is that children's experiences, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, is what's helping to develop their brain. And it says there that children in deprived environments, such as Romanian orphanages, may have depressed brain activity. And that's simply because they are not having that close interaction with consistent adults. They are not maybe being brought outside on walks or spoken to or brought really close to a human's face to make those connections and to experience those experiences. It talks about this guy, Michael Rabin's hemispheres of his brain and something that happened to him when he was younger. If you did not get that the first time you read it, go back and read that because it is really interesting. Neuroconstructionist views interactions between experience and gene expression in the brain's development, and they view those as really important. This is going to help us develop our language. Biological processes and environmental conditions influence the brain's development. Those environmental conditions are things that you can really manipulate in a child's life to make sure that they are having the right conditions for the best brain growth. Our brains are always growing, and we even talked in last chapter about this idea of plasticity. And then, of course, development of the brain and child's cognitive development are closely linked. The interactions that they have will help build a child's cognition. The brain has 4 lobes. This is something that you're going to need to know about in the near future. We have our frontal lobes, our temporal lobes, and how those are broken down. I would make sure that I understand this really well in your text, or even pause this and read these slides, but there's no need for me to read them to you specifically. When we talk about how a child is developing, sleep is very, very important. And it discusses for a little bit why exactly we sleep. Sleep is necessary for survival. If you are an undergraduate student and you need to hear that again, sleep is necessary for survival. Please make sure that you are getting enough sleep. It replenishes and rebuilds the brain and the body. It helps restore function. It helps clear out waste in neural tissue, and it helps for that brain plasticity, how your brain is constantly evolving and growing. Sleep is a major contributor to that. Typical newborns sleeps about 16 to 17 hours a day. Infant sleep-related problems affect 15 to 25% of infants. If you guys have ever had a newborn in your house, or you have had a child yourself, you can probably relate to some of these things. This is really interesting at the bottom, this REM sleep, eye movement under closed lids. Half of infants' sleep is REM sleep, and a lot of times these scientists are saying that that helps promote infants' brain development. So even when they're sleeping, they are still experiencing things that can help that brain development. This differs as adults. We have about a fifth of our sleep is actual REM sleep. Sleep may be positively linked to cognitive development. And when we talk about cognitive development, we're saying people's memories and their language, their executive function, how well they can survive, is linked to how much sleep they're getting. This is probably because the brain and is the brain and memory is consolidating, which is really important, which is going to help us again with better memory and language, our executive feelings, our executive function in managing our feelings. Sleep is very important to infant development, and so of course is nutrition. Nutritional needs and eating behavior. Infants should consume about 50 calories per day for each pound they weigh. If it often feels like they are eating constantly, they are. As their motor skills improve, their eating habits change. A lot of times they will go from a suck and swallow to a chew and swallow movement. Super important, they need to have a varied diet. It needs to include fruits and vegetables. It was very sad to me to read in our text that the most common vegetable fed to 15 months old are French fries. And so just think about that when we are thinking about infants. And even as old as 15 months, we need to be constantly introducing new types of foods and making sure that they are getting a good amount of fruits and vegetables. A French fry is not a vegetable, just like us adults. From birth to 1 year old, these children are going to triple their weight and increase their length by 40%. And of course, they need a lot of fuel to do so. We can even look at when we are feeding our baby's milk, exactly what that looks like. You can look at breast versus bottle feeding. Science is currently saying that breastfeeding is better for baby's health, and you can look at the long list of benefits if a child is being breastfed. Infants are less likely to develop some ear infections, become overweight, develop type 1 diabetes in childhood, or adult type 2 diabetes, suffer from SIDS. From a mother's point of view, there is lower incidences of breast cancer and ovarian cancer if you nurse your children, and a reduced rate of type 2 diabetes. These are all very positive and encouraging results on why we should be breastfeeding, but it is important to note that mothers should not breastfeed when they are infected with HIV or other infectious diseases, if she currently has active tuberculosis, or if she's taking any drugs. Additional issues should be mentioned that breastfeeding can be physically difficult. It is difficult for some women to breastfeed. When you are in the hospital, if you do give birth in a hospital, there is a huge team of people that can help you do this. But again, can be physically difficult. Not all studies imply causality between health benefits and breastfeeding. Most studies are correlational. And evidence of psychological differences between breastfed and bottle-fed infants is inconclusive. Give it a couple more years and they might be more developed, those studies. Let's look at motor development in infancy. We're going to be looking at reflexes, gross and fine motor skills. When we look at this thing called dynamic systems view, it's the idea that infants assemble motor skills for perceiving and acting. They're just not doing it because they're bored. They are doing it to meet their own personal goals, which is kind of goofy to think about. But in order to develop motor skills, infants must perceive something in the environment that motivates them to move or act or pull up or to reach out. And so that goal is going to motivate them into movement. The idea that they are not just passive learners, that they are active learners at this age is kind of interesting. And what we can see is that the nervous system is maturing, body's physical properties like their strength is the potential for movement, for example, motor control, child's motivation to reach a goal, create new motor behavior, for example, walking is one of them. Other type of reflexes that our children at this point are experiencing. A reflex is simply just a built-in reaction to stimuli, but some of their reflexes are very interesting. A rooting reflex occurs when the infant's cheek is stroked or the side of the mouth is touched. When this happens, the infant will turn his or her head in effort to find something to suck. And we can tie this again to that nursing situations. That sucking reflex occurs when newborns automatically suck an object placed in their mouth. And of course, it enables them to get nourishment, and it helps them self-soothe in certain times in their life. Looking at other reflexes, this Moro reflex is a startle response that occurs in reaction to a sudden, intense noise or movement. It's when they act very, very surprised, and you can see them, they'll end up throwing their head back, flinging out their arms and legs, arching back, and then pulling it all back together. It's believed to be a way of grabbing for support if they were, in fact, to be falling. And then our last one here is this grasping reflex, and it occurs when someone touches the infant's palms. If you've ever done that, the infant will respond by grasping tightly on what has been laid in their palm. There is a very quick, about 1 minute video that I want you to toggle over to Canvas and just see some of these examples. They're just YouTube videos. It's just one YouTube video, but go ahead and pause this and then come back to me after you have watched that 1 minute video that is on Canvas. So we can see a lot of different milestones in gross motor development. Something that I want you to look at while you're looking at this chart is that all of these are variations of time, okay? We can see at the bottom, they have listed age in months, and then we can see different things that children will be able to develop through their gross motor skills, like when are they going to lift up their head? Some children are lifting up that head as soon as they're born. Some it takes almost a month, but you can see those very long red boxes. If I am even looking at walk using furniture for support, some are starting directly after 7 months, and some are waiting until they're almost over a year old to start that concept. And so just spend some time looking, when do children typically roll over or sit without support? When are they walking alone? But you can also see kind of this stair step of skills that they are doing one after the other. They don't have to be mastered in this format, but often they are. This is another time that I'm going to have you toggle between our Canvas site, and there is a motor development video that's about 7 minutes long, but it is fantastic, and I want you just to view that and maybe think how parts of the text has actually reminded you of parts of that video. So go ahead and pause this and toggle over to that 7 minute video and then come back to me. We have talked about infant gross motor skills, and we've talked about their reflexes. Now we're going to take just a little bit of time and we're going to talk about their fine motor skills. Um, infants are involved more finely tuned movements, such as dexterity, like how easily they can move their fingers. Something called the pincher grip is the idea that infants can grasp small objects using their forefinger, your pointer finger, and your thumb. They can pinch. Um, this is necessary for infants to coordinate with grasping and picking up things, and it is something that you will see infants begin to do. It's a fine motor skill because it's using some of those smaller muscles. When we look at sensation and perception, sensation occurs when information interacts with sensory receptors. And so it is interacting with their eyes or their ears, their tongue, their nose, their skin. Perception is interpretation of what is sensed. So first we will have the sensation, an infant will have the sensation, and then perception is what is interpreted. I can hear with my ears a certain sensation, and it might be comforting, it might be shrill. I can sense something with my tongue, and it might be sweet, it could be bumpy. But those two different things, I would like for you to know the difference between sensation and perception. But this idea of perception is how they discover their world. If you watch an infant, they are going to be licking things and putting them in their mouths and poking at them, along with looking and listening and sniffing. Methods to study infant perception. We have the visual preference method, which determines whether infants can distinguish one stimulus from another by measuring the length of time they attend to different stimuli. And so things that are interesting in your textbook does a good job talking about it. And one of its graphics is a lot of times the human face is something that can hold the attention of an infant for a longer amount of time. There is something called the orienting response and eye tracking. And with small children, infants doing this, it's the idea that they are turning their head toward a sight or a sound. We are going to watch a video here in a couple slides, and it gives a really good example of that. When they hear or see something, that they go ahead and they turn their head to give that attention. Visual perception. Newborn's vision is estimated at 2,600. Vision clarity improves from fuzzy at 1 month to clear at 1 year. Within hours of birth, newborns prefer already to look at faces over other objects. And we can also see that color vision, 4 to 8 weeks, color vision develops. By 4 months, they prefer saturated colors over just more plain black and white type things. Their visual perception, the first 2 months of postnatal development, infants don't perceive objects as complete. So if you are looking at something in the space that you're occupying now, if you can only see half of it, you know the other half exists. An infant will only think only half of that object exists. At about 2 months of age, infants develop the ability to perceive that, oh, that object is whole, I just cannot see all of it. Let's talk a moment about hearing. Something very interesting that the textbook brings up that I have always loved is that infants can hear in utero, that they can hear songs, mother's voice, other sounds around them. As infants age, sensitivity increases to loudness, pitch, and localization. So they're going to be able to pick up specific sounds. I'm going to take a moment to kind of fly through Piaget's theory of infant development, especially because this is not a theory class. But what I am going to ask you to do for your reflection for this lecture is to think about, okay, how does Piaget's theory of processing new information and how infants, children, students, adults take in and process new information, how does that have anything to do with my future classroom? So as we're going through these next couple slides, really think about that. These are some things that you really need to know in your academic language toolbox, and you will need to know for interviews, and you will need to know for licensure tests. The first one is Piaget's idea of schemes. Those are actions or mental representations that organize knowledge. You might have heard it referred to as maybe like schemata. And it's just those, I've always thought of them as like file folders in someone's mind. I have a schema over cats. In my mind, they all are four-legged, hairy creatures with long tails, and they say meow. That is what my scheme holds for cats in my mind. That differs from dogs or balls or donuts, okay? All of those have their own file folder of knowledge in my brain. Assimilation is another word that you need to know, and it's using existing schemes to deal with new information or experiences. I go to the zoo for the first time, and I see a snow leopard. Okay, is it a cat? Because it does have 4 legs. It is hairy, it has a long tail, but it did not meow at me, it kind of growled at me. And so I'm using my existing knowledge of something to deal with new information. An accommodation is adjusting that information to fit new information experiences. Okay, now I'm going to say my cat rules for my file folder is 4 legs, hairy, long tail, and can make some type of noise. I'm also going to add in there that they're not small. Sometimes they can be big. That's accommodating new information. Organization is grouping of isolated behaviors and thoughts into a higher order system. And equilibration in stages of development. You need to know what that means, and that's the idea by which children shift from one stage of thought to the next, and the idea that we're always trying to be equal in our thoughts. We're trying to always understand the world around us. Disequilibrium is cognitive conflict. Oh, well, they said this is a cat, but I thought cats always follow these rules. Your brains are constantly doing that, even as adults. Individuals go through 4 stages of development, says Piaget, and cognition is qualitatively different from one stage to another. Again, think about how this information would be useful in your future classroom. I think I talked that whole entire slide. When we are looking at these different stages of development, the first one is our sensory motor stage. It lasts from birth to about 2 years of age. And at that time, these children are constructing an understanding of the world by coordinating sensory experiences. And remember those sensory experiences. How does it taste? How does it smell? How does it feel with my tongue and my cheek and my hand? If I smush it with my foot, what happens? But that sensory motor, they are using all of their senses to judge the world around them. Object permanence is another one of those words and terms that you need to know. It's the idea that understanding that objects and events continue to exist even when it's not there. And you can see that child playing peekaboo. Children who are completely delighted with object permanence are completely delighted with peekaboo have not acquired object permanence yet. They think it is thrilling that that thing is still there even when they cannot see it. So when we are looking at Piaget's sensory motor stage, and that's all we're going to talk about for this, although there are several others, in infants, that's really where these children are at. Piaget thought not to be specific enough about how infants learn about their world, and so there are other theorists that go into more detail. Infant cognition has become extremely specialized, and so there's a lot more science based on this, and we're currently trying to understand how developmental changes in cognition take place. And we're examining the big issue for nature versus nurture, and your textbook talks about that. And we are studying more of the brain's role in cognition development. When we are looking at learning, remembering, and conceptualizing, there are some different things that you need to understand, especially in an infant's life. Language is so important. And language is not just simply spoken or listened to. It, of course, can be spoken or it can be written. It can be signed through the hands or other ways. Um, it is based on a system of symbols, not words, but just symbols. And it lets us pass down information or pass information to other groups of people. Um, its infinite generativity is the ability to produce an endless number of meaningful sentences using a group of words or rules. Now, a lot of times, this language doesn't follow the rules that adults follow. You can probably think of a way that you used to say a certain word. My daughter, when she was younger, she would put her clothes in the dirty hamp closer rather than the dirty clothes hamper. Okay, and so language does follow rules, but sometimes it takes a while for small children to pick up on those rules. Language develops by recognizing first sounds. Then children will begin to babble and vocalize, a lot of times through crying or cooing or babbling. They are going to point and show things. And a lot of times their first words um, happen because they are so receptive to vocabulary. They are taking in so much and they are taking in way more and they understand way more than they're going to be able to produce through spoken vocabulary. This is the last time I'm going to have you pause. I want you to view a Reading Rockets video, and it's called Tuning into Speech. It's barely 3 minutes long, but I want you to look at some of these things that we have been discussing, and even your textbook mentions a specific scientist, and she's on here speaking, and it's just a really fascinating approach to language and for us as adults understanding speech and sounds. So pause this and then come back to me. Language can develop in several different ways, and some things that I need for you to know. These are probably your last couple words that you need to make sure that you understand is the idea of overextension, and that's when children apply a word to objects that are inappropriate for the word's meaning. Underextension is applying a word too narrowly. A grape is only purple. That's not true. Vocalization is the idea of crying, cooing, babbling, making all of those sounds. And then we have a process when children begin to speak, and they begin with utterances. And that is when a child is conveying meaning to someone else. And a lot of times that is done in maybe one or two words. Mommy, up. Okay, they are communicating what they want to be said. And then we eventually get to telegraphic speech, which is short and precise words. There's not really much grammar that's applied, but they are using, just think of it like a telegraph, that's something very long and skinny. They are using very small, simple words to communicate their needs to someone else. We can see for our ending slide these language milestones, and you can see from birth what is expected, roughly when the first word is spoken, if you're backing up, when babbling begins, and then when we have just those first utterances happening right before the explosion of our full sentences. I hope you guys learned something. Remember, for your one-page typed reflection, you are going to look back at how Piaget thinks that we attain knowledge through the chapter discussion that was the text through what you read, and then also what we discussed in this lecture, and how can we use that knowledge to affect when we teach others in our future lives, if we're going to become educators, or if you're going into a different field thinking, okay, if I go into business, I'm going to have to communicate and educate others on my perspective or what I'm representing or selling. If you guys have any questions, as always, please let me know, and keep on going.